Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I moved into the apartment on a whim. It was cheap, quiet, and just close enough to work to be convenient. The landlord mentioned it had been sitting empty for a while, but I didn't think much of it. A fresh start sounded good. Say the first few days passed uneventfully. The place was bare but clean, with old wooden floors that creaked slightly underfoot. There was only one odd feature: a tall, antique mirror bolted to the wall in the hallway. Its ornate, gilded frame looked out of place, but it was too heavy to remove, so I left it. The mirror unnerved me almost immediately. Its surface was flawless, yet somehow it seemed darker than it should have been. Light didn't reflect off it quite right, and every time I walked past, I felt like it was watching me. Still, I told myself it was just my imagination. It started small. At first, I noticed subtle differences when I glanced at the reflection. Things didn't align quite right. The hallway behind me seemed just a little too dim, the angle slightly skewed. But when I turned to look behind me, everything was normal. One night, I woke up to a soft, creaking noise. It sounded like someone pacing in the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart pounded as I listened, the sound slow and deliberate. I grabbed my phone for the flashlight, crept to the door, and flung it open. Nothing. The mirror stood silently in the dim hallway, its surface dark. But when I moved closer, I noticed something. My reflection wasn't right. I was standing still, but my reflection swayed ever so slightly, as if it were breathing. I froze. My own face stared back at me, its expression blank, almost bored. Then, slowly, it smiled. I staggered back, tripping over my feet and falling to the floor. The reflection stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, but I wasn't moving at all. The hallway around me felt colder, the air heavy and damp. "Stop," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. Myself, or whatever, was in the mirror. The reflection tilted its head, mimicking the motion, then stopped. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but its grin widened. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object, a shoe, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, the reflection rippled like water, distorting and twisting before returning to its unnerving stillness. My face was still, there, smiling at me with wide, glassy eyes. I locked myself in my bedroom after that, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floor made me jump. Every shadow sent waves of terror through me. Morning, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my things in a hurry, avoiding the hallway as much as possible. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, the knob wouldn't budge. I tried the windows next, but they wouldn't open either. The apartment had become a prison. As I stood in the living room, breathing hard, the mirror caught my eye. The reflection was gone. The hallway and the glass was empty, dark, and wrong. Then I heard it, footsteps behind me. I turned, but no one was there. My chest tightened as the sound grew louder, circling me, closer and closer until it was deafening. A hand clamped down on my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. Just the mirror, where my reflection had returned. But it wasn't moving with me anymore. It stood perfectly still, staring at me with hollow, black eyes. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was outside, lying on the pavement in front of the building. My belongings were stacked neatly beside me, but the mirror wasn't there. I never went back. I don't know what I saw in that apartment, or how I got out. But sometimes when I catch my reflection in a window or a store mirror, I swear it's smiling back at me. I've always hated museums. The dim lighting, the echoing footsteps on the polished floors, it always felt oppressive, like history was closing in on me. But on that particular evening, curiosity got the better of me. A friend of mine had convinced me to visit an old abandoned art museum on the outskirts of town. It was said to be haunted, though I didn't put much stock in ghost stories. A perfect way to escape the city, they'd said. I agreed, reluctantly. When we arrived, the place was everything I expected, a relic of another time. Dusty glass cases displayed faded paintings of figures long forgotten, their expressions forever locked in uncertainty. The air was thick with mildew and the faint smell of old paper. It wasn't just quiet, it was silent, as if the building itself held its breath. We wandered through the exhibits, the creak of our footsteps echoing off the empty halls. My friend, oblivious to the oppressive atmosphere, was too busy snapping photos and making jokes. I followed, my senses on high alert, wondering why we had decided to come here. It wasn't until we reached the main hall that the unease became overwhelming. The space was grand, with towering ceilings and a vast, empty display of once majestic sculptures. But now, everything felt hollow, lifeless. My skin crawled as I noticed the shadows in the corners of the room, darker than the rest of the shadows cast by the dim lighting. We stood there for a while, the stillness pressing in from all sides. My friend suddenly stopped, his phone flashlight illuminating a cracked statue of some ancient god. He turned to me, his expression more serious than I'd seen it before. "Did you hear that?" "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Footsteps. I swear," he said, his eyes darting toward the far end of the hall. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for the first time that night, fear replaced skepticism. The silence wasn't silence anymore. There was something moving in the shadows, something that didn't belong. We listened, and sure enough, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the vast space. It wasn't ours. The steps were slower, deliberate, almost as if they were searching for something. My friend looked at me, wide-eyed. "We should go." I nodded, my body trembling. We turned back the way we came, every step now feeling heavier, every sound amplifying. The footsteps seemed closer, as if they were chasing us through the empty halls. Suddenly, my phone's flashlight flickered, then went out. I fumbled for it, my fingers shaking. When it came back on, I saw something that made my stomach churn. There was a figure standing at the end of the hallway, tall, gaunt, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. We sprinted, not looking back, but I could feel it following. The footsteps echoed behind us, closer, until we burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. We didn't stop until we were well away from the museum. We haven't been back since. I'm not sure what we saw that night, but I know one thing. It wasn't human. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me, my wife, and our old tent. We had decided to spend the weekend camping at a quiet spot far from town, a remote forest preserve where we hadn't been before. No phone service, no distractions, just nature. We had always loved the quiet, the peace. That night, we pitched our tent by the edge of a small misty lake. The sound of frogs croaking and the distant rustling of leaves filled the air. For a while, everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting about nothing in particular. The forest was alive with sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the scuttling of small animals in the underbrush. But there was one sound that didn't fit. Something soft and irregular, almost mechanical. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was the wind. But then it stopped, only to start again, closer this time. It was a faint rhythmic thud, like someone lightly tapping a tree. I glanced around, but the woods were dark and quiet, save for that strange noise. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "What's that noise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My wife furrowed her brow, listening intently. "I don't know. It's probably just something out there." I didn't believe her. The tapping wasn't like any natural sound we'd heard before. It felt deliberate, almost as if something, or someone, was pacing the perimeter of our campsite. "We should head to bed," I suggested, trying to mask my unease. We snuffed out the fire and climbed into the tent, pulling the flaps closed behind us. The sound followed us. The rhythmic tapping continued, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't far. It was coming from just beyond the edge of the trees, and whatever it wasn't stopping. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every few minutes I woke, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound seemed closer now, more deliberate. The faint rustling of leaves wasn't wind, it was movement. Then something shifted in the darkness. I saw it, a pair of pale eyes staring at us from between the trees. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. I held my breath, frozen with fear. My wife stirred beside me, unaware of the figure just outside the tent. I could barely hear her breathing over the pounding of my heart. After what felt like hours, the eyes blinked and vanished. The tapping stopped. The forest went silent again, but this time, the silence was worse. In the morning, we crept out of the tent, both of us pale and exhausted. The forest was still, but something felt off, unnaturally still. My wife pointed at the ground, her voice trembling. "Footprints," she said. I followed her gaze to the soft earth around our campsite. There were clear, human-like footprints leading away from the tent and into the woods, but they didn't belong to us. We never found out what was watching us that night. We packed our things and left the forest behind, leaving the strange footprints and the silent eyes in the dark. To this day, I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't left. It started on a normal afternoon, a day like any other. I had taken my son to the old park, the one we used to go to when he was younger. The park had always been a peaceful escape from the city, full of tall trees and winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Today, though, something felt off. We had the whole place to ourselves, which wasn't unusual. It was a weekday, and most people didn't visit parks during these hours. I let my son run ahead, chasing after a frisbee he'd thrown. I stood at the edge of a small pond watching him play. The water rippled under the weight of the afternoon sun, and the sound of the birds was soothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see another parent or maybe a jogger, but there was no one. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself, but as I turned back to the pond, the footsteps came again. This time, closer. My son didn't seem to notice, still lost in his game. I told myself I was just on edge. The woods could make noises feel louder than they were, right? But the footsteps weren't fading. They were steady, relentless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had wandered into the park, someone harmless. Still, my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the sound, but saw no one. The footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the pond. My son, still unaware, continued chasing the frisbee, laughing as he ran. "Stop playing," I shouted, my voice trembling now. "We're leaving." He didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't care. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave him. Then, as I stepped toward the pond, I saw something. Something in the water. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure. A shadow, floating just beneath the surface. It wasn't moving like anything natural. It seemed to be watching us. Unmoving. Unmoving. I took a step back from the water, my breath hitching in my throat. What was it? Some kind of trick of the light? My mind raced, but fear took over. I had to get my son. "Come on," I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. My son didn't seem to hear me. He was too far gone in his play, oblivious to the danger I now felt closing in. I sprinted toward him, my heart screaming with every step. I grabbed his arm, pulling him hard. His laughter stopped, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" "We're leaving." "Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. As I turned back toward the path, I saw it again. The figure, this time fully visible. It stood at the edge of the pond, watching us. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. Its form was blurred, not entirely solid, but its eyes were unmistakable. Dark, hollow, watching us. I held my son tighter, running, my breath ragged. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that place. As we reached the park entrance, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless, watching us. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat, racing through my ears. We never went back to that park, and I never looked into water the same way again. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run. I knew that. But my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it, the sound of something else, a faint whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. The night sky stretched endlessly above the old train tracks. We were out there, just friends on a camping trip, away from everything. No phones, no towns, just the woods and the faint sound of a distant train. It was supposed to be peaceful, a night of campfires, laughter, and staring up at the stars. But everything changed when we stumbled across the old station. We hadn't planned on visiting it. It wasn't on any map, but curiosity led us off the trail. The station had been abandoned for decades, weathered by time and overgrown with vines. The roof had caved in, leaving skeletal beams exposed. It was eerie, but we thought it would make a cool spot to rest for a while. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like thin curtains. We joked about the ghosts, making light of the old station's dark past, but something didn't feel right. As we wandered deeper into the building, one of my friends, Emily, stopped abruptly, staring at the wall. We all gathered around, shining our flashlights where she pointed. The wall was covered in writing. Scrawled in faded, jagged letters were words that made my blood run cold. "Help us." None of us spoke. We stood there, frozen, as if the very silence around us was pressing down. There were other messages, scratched out beneath, phrases we couldn't make sense of. Words about trains, about waiting, and something else entirely. "They're still coming." That's when the whispers began. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I turned to see if anyone else had heard them, but my friends were motionless, their eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It felt like they were closing in on us. We bolted from the building, running back toward our campsite, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the endless rustling of the trees. My chest heaved as we made it back to the clearing, but we couldn't escape what followed. Back at the campfire, we all sat in silence, watching the flickering flames. I kept glancing toward the trees, waiting, expecting to hear something again. But it was the quiet that frightened me the most. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those words, that feeling of being watched. Even now, I wonder what was meant by those messages, and if they're still out there, waiting. We left the station behind, but the memories of what we saw have never left me. The train is long gone, but I know they're still out there. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open. But what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. It was late summer, and my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to an old remote cabin in the woods. But this wasn't your typical cabin-in-the-woods getaway. No flickering lights, no whispers of ghosts. Instead, it was a well-maintained retreat, far from civilization, nestled at the edge of a serene, winding lake. The cabin was beautiful, its wooden exterior weathered but solid, surrounded by towering pines and the soft echo of crickets. We packed our gear, set up by the dock, and spent the day lounging by the water, soaking in the sun, and enjoying the peaceful isolation. The place had a strange charm, almost too perfect, like it had been untouched by time. But that sense of stillness unsettled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place wasn't right. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness stretched across the lake, We gathered around a bonfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The woods were quiet, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something. Something off, something watching. I didn't say anything at first. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The others seemed relaxed, laughing and enjoying themselves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, or something, lurking just beyond the trees. It started small, barely noticeable at first. Shadows flitting between the trees, just out of sight. The sound of footsteps crunching leaves, but no one else seemed to hear them. My pulse quickened and I kept turning, expecting to catch a glimpse of someone, but there was nothing. Or so I thought. As I watched the trees, I noticed the darkness seemed to deepen, more oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then came the whispering. Soft at first, like the wind, but growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't human speech, but something deeper, more guttural. "Come closer." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from the woods. It was closer, much closer. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the air like it was right behind me. My stomach turned. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw them. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, barely visible. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was distorted, like it was bending in ways it shouldn't. Too tall, too thin. Its face was a hollow void. No features, no eyes, just darkness. The whispers came again, louder this time. "Come." I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The others, still by the fire, didn't seem to notice. I wanted to scream, to call out, but no sound would come. Then, like a flicker of a dream, the figure disappeared, swallowed by the trees. The whispering faded, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. When I finally found my voice, I managed to mumble to my friends, trying to act calm, though my hands shook uncontrollably. They brushed off my concerns, laughing and calling me paranoid. We stayed up a little longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that had never truly left. That night, I lay awake, listening to every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside. When morning came, the air felt different. The woods seemed quiet, peaceful even. But as we packed our things and left the cabin behind, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as if something, or someone, was still there, watching us from the shadows. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range miles from the nearest town. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there, watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I'd lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human. but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, Eagle Point, 5 miles. I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. I still can't forget that night in the abandoned subway station. It was supposed to be a routine trip home after a long day, but everything felt off from the moment I stepped onto the platform. I had just missed the last train, so I found myself alone in the dim light of the old station. The air was thick with dust, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. There wasn't a soul in sight, and even the usual sounds of distant trains were absent. The station had a strange, heavy atmosphere, as though the city itself had forgotten about it. I sat down on the platform bench, my phone dimming as I glanced at it. No signal. I sighed, slipping it back into my pocket. That's when I noticed the flickering lights. The fluorescent bulbs hummed and flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the tiles. The whole place felt like it was slipping into another dimension. Time passed, or at least it felt like it did. The stillness stretched on and the silence grew deeper. Then I heard something, a soft, dragging noise echoing from somewhere deeper into the station. It was slow, uneven, like someone was shuffling along the tiles. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. I should have left, but something kept me there, my fear rooted in place. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it, a figure. It was tall, gaunt, and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but I could see the unsettling way it tilted its head as if listening. The closer it came, the more I realized its footsteps didn't match any human pattern. They were uneven, like someone dragging something heavy behind them. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked in place. I couldn't look away as the figure got closer. It wasn't until it was right in front of me that I saw it. A faint, hollow glow where its eyes should have been. The smell hit me first. Something rotten and metallic. The silence broke into a low, distorted whisper, like the sound of something ancient and wrong. "Leave," it rasped, its voice sounding almost mechanical. "Not supposed to be here." In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed to run, but when I turned to flee, my legs buckled beneath me. The creature was gone, vanished like a memory. The subway station was still and empty once more, the lights flickering as though nothing had ever happened. I got up and made my way to the edge of the platform, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. Even now, I wonder what I saw that night, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to stumble into the darkness. I'll never forget that summer afternoon when I went for a hike. I wasn't a hiker, far from it. I was out of shape, but the trails near the mountains had always called to me. The air was warm, the sun was bright, and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I decided to take a trail that led deeper into the woods, away from the main paths and the familiar sounds of civilization. At first, everything seemed perfect. The birds chirped, the trees rustled gently in the breeze, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I wasn't exactly sure where I was going, but I didn't care. It felt freeing to be away from the constant noise of phones, people, and the city. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift as I lost track of time. Then, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't sudden, more like the gradual descent into something off. The birds stopped singing, and the forest became eerily silent. The air felt heavier, thicker. The light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, almost unnatural. I noticed the shadows stretching longer than they should have, growing darker, more menacing. My stomach twisted. I stopped and looked around, unsure why I felt so uncomfortable. Everything seemed the same. Trees, rocks, the trail, but something wasn't right. My instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scanning the forest. There was no one, just the trees, endless and unchanging. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt eyes on me, watching. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail curved ahead, leading deeper into the woods, but I didn't want to go any farther. I wanted to turn back. My breath grew ragged, and with each step the sense of being followed only grew stronger. Then I heard it. The faintest whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like my name, softly spoken, carried on the wind. I froze. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The forest was still, except for the sound of my own breathing. My head was spinning, and my chest felt tight. I kept walking, but every instinct in me told me to turn around and leave. I glanced back once, and for a moment I could swear I saw something. Just a flash of movement, disappearing behind a tree. My pace quickened, and as I did, the whispers began again, louder this time. They surrounded me, coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of them sent chills down my spine. Panic gripped me. I wasn't thinking straight anymore. I ran. The trail twisted and turned, but I couldn't see the end. The woods felt endless, and the deeper I went, the darker everything became. I could barely make out the path beneath my feet. Then I heard it again. A voice, closer this time, clearer, more distinct. "Turn back," it said, but it wasn't human. It was hollow, distorted, like the echo of something long dead. "Leave this place." I stumbled, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't care about the trail anymore. Nothing mattered except getting out. My mind was screaming for answers, but I knew there weren't any. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees into a clearing. My eyes widened. There, in front of me, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its eyes were black, hollow, and empty. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with a cold, unsettling stare. I stopped, paralyzed by fear. My breath hitched and my legs felt like they would give out. But something inside me told me to run. I had to get away. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, but the forest seemed endless. Every shadow felt alive, every noise a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something that had followed me from the moment I stepped off the trail. Hours later, I made it out. I don't remember much of the journey back, only that I kept running, not knowing if I'd ever escape. To this day, I don't know what that figure was or why it followed me. The forest isn't the same to me anymore. There's a quiet, lingering fear every time I step into the woods, a reminder of that day when I became lost in a world I couldn't explain. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises. Something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. "I'm still here." This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. "I'll be with you, always." I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. It was a hot summer evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light, casting long shadows down the sidewalks. I lived in an old, quiet, suburban neighborhood that had once been bustling, but now felt hollow and deserted. Most of the houses were dark, their windows blank and lifeless. As I walked, I noticed the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling leaves. It was unnaturally still. The only sounds were the faint echoes of my own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Halfway through my walk, I noticed something off about the house 2 doors down from mine. Its porch light was flickering, buzzing faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be on or off. The windows were dark, and there was a strange emptiness to the place, as if the house itself had been abandoned long ago. But the most unsettling part was the shape standing by the front door. A tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was just the edge of a tree or a dark outline of the house. But then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't seem human. It wasn't walking like someone lost or wandering. It moved with purpose, as if it were waiting, watching for something. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to turn and run. I wanted to shout, to call out, but something held me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, staring in my direction. I could barely make out its outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, the way it stood so still, yet seemed entirely aware of my presence. Slowly, it began to move towards me, taking long, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost close enough to make out its features when suddenly, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, facing me, just a few yards away. The silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without any discernible reason, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost mechanical, like it had been recorded and played back. "You should not be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I tried to take a step backward, but my body wouldn't move. The figure began to step closer again, and I could feel my panic rising. It tilted its head again, tilting toward me as if it was studying something. Then, almost too quietly to hear, it whispered, "You should have left already." Suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. My legs moved on their own, and I bolted down the street, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't look back, not once, until I was safely back home, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The figure's words haunted me. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. And I pray I never see it again. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, or someone from a distant campsite. But no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me, or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. I had always loved the quiet solitude of the forest. Growing up, I would spend hours walking through the trees, lost in my thoughts, letting the sounds of nature calm my mind. But that day, something felt different, off in a way I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to take a long hike. The weather was perfect, warm, sunny, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead and started walking, following the familiar path that twisted deeper into the woods. The forest felt vast and peaceful, as it always did, but today there was a strange stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence that seemed unnatural. After about an hour, I came to a clearing, a large, flat expanse of moss-covered ground surrounded by towering trees. I decided to stop there and rest for a while. I lay back on a bed of soft grass, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. Not just birds, but everything. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. My heart began to pound as I sat up and looked around. The air felt heavy, like something was looming just beyond my view. I stood and started walking again. though my sense of peace was gone. The silence wasn't just unnerving, it felt wrong. I felt like something was watching me, like the forest wasn't supposed to be this quiet. My footsteps became quicker, my breathing faster. Hours seemed to pass, though I wasn't sure how much time had actually gone by. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I needed to turn back, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. As I walked, I came to a narrow footbridge over a shallow creek. I hesitated before stepping onto it, the creaking wood beneath my feet making me pause. The water below was eerily still, almost too still. I looked down into the water, but there was nothing there. No fish, no movement at all. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite right either, distorted as if the water itself was not quite real. It wasn't until I reached the other side that I realized how quiet the creek had been. There wasn't even the sound of flowing water. I shook my head, trying to push away the sense of dread that was creeping up on me. The trees seemed to close in around me as I continued walking. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against my shoulders, the stillness pressing into my ears. It wasn't just quiet. It felt like something was missing from the world. The forest wasn't supposed to feel this way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I began to run, though my legs ached. My breath came in ragged gasps. The forest around me seemed to blur, the shadows twisting and shifting unnaturally. I wasn't sure if it was my fear playing tricks on me or if something was actually happening. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, closer than I expected. My legs locked up, my body frozen as I stood there in the dark, unable to move. The whisper repeated itself, louder now, closer, like someone or something was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. The whisper stopped, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the very air had grown colder. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I stood there, trembling. It wasn't until the whisper returned, right next to my ear, that I broke free from the paralysis. I bolted down the trail, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me. The trees blurred past in a chaotic rush, my breath ragged, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw my car in the distance. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life beneath me. As I drove away from the forest, I realized that I didn't know what had followed me, or why, but something had, and it still felt like it was out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions. Just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. I remember the night clearly, even though I wish I didn't. It wasn't like a typical horror story where something obvious happens and you can't look away. No, this was different. A quiet, unsettling terror that crept in slowly, unnoticed, until it was already too late. It started with an evening trip. A group of us decided to go for a hike up an old, abandoned mountain trail that no one in town really talked about anymore. The path was barely visible through the trees, and we figured it'd be fun to explore something that felt off the map. No one else had been there in years, from what we'd heard. The trail wasn't difficult at first, just some rocky terrain and patches of overgrown bushes. But as we kept walking deeper into the forest, something felt off. The air seemed thick, heavier. The usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves were replaced by a strange, oppressive silence. Even the forest itself felt strange, like it was watching us. We had been hiking for what felt like hours when we came across a clearing, a wide space surrounded by towering pines. There was an old, crumbling structure at the center of the clearing. It looked like a small, forgotten cabin, its roof partially caved in, and the walls worn with age. None of us had expected to find something like this out here. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. "We should check it out," one of my friends, Mark, said, stepping toward the cabin. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. The closer we got, the more uneasy I became. The silence seemed to thicken, as though the forest itself had swallowed all sound. The door of the cabin creaked open under our weight, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture and remnants of something long forgotten. We stepped inside, hesitant, but everything seemed still. There was nothing alive inside except for us. As we poked around, one of my friends, Laura, pointed out something strange. The walls were covered in old, faded drawings. Children's drawings, but they weren't the usual cheerful, innocent sketches. These were distorted, eerie, figures with hollow eyes, twisted shapes, and scribbled faces that seemed to stare at us from the faded paper. "That's creepy," Mark said, turning pale. We quickly decided to leave, but as we stepped outside, the feeling of unease only deepened. It wasn't just the creepy drawings or the old decaying cabin. It was something else. A presence. It wasn't threatening, but there was an undeniable sense that we weren't supposed to be there. We moved quickly through the woods, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that had settled over us. The trail became steeper, harder to follow as we pressed on, and the oppressive silence grew even thicker. Then, as we were about to turn back, we heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind us. But there was no one there. "Guys, stop," I whispered, turning around. The others froze. "I hear it too," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the tree line, following us. We hurried, but the sound seemed to be growing closer, as though whatever was following us was keeping pace. No matter how far we went, the noise remained, distant but persistent. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finally reached the trailhead, we stopped, breathing heavily. The trees loomed around us, shadows stretching long in the fading light. That's when I realized something was missing. One of my friends, Emma, was gone. "Where's Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling. The others looked at each other, panic setting in. We split up, calling her name, but the only response was silence. The woods had swallowed her, leaving us alone once again. We couldn't find Emma. We never did. She was just gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of where she might have gone. The forest had taken her, and we were too afraid to go back in and search again. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in those woods, something that watched us, followed us, and took Emma. And whatever it was, I'm convinced it's still out there, waiting. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. "Whispers from the Void." My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me, and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest, and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me. but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse, it was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea, it felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out, but the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it or if I was the only one who ever would. I was on a road trip with some friends, driving through endless flatlands that stretched out like a forgotten world. It was just us. No towns, no cell service, just miles of dry, cracked earth and endless sky. We had set out from the city, heading towards some isolated national park that none of us had ever visited before. The sun had long since set by the time we realized we were lost. The GPS had been spotty from the beginning, and now, deep in the middle of nowhere, it had completely failed us. The horizon seemed to blur into itself, and the landscape looked more like a dream than reality. No lights from towns, no signs of life, just us and the desolation. As we drove, a fog rolled in, creeping along the ground like something alive. It wasn't cold, just oppressive. The air felt thick, and the quiet was unsettling. We passed what looked like old, rusted-out vehicles, abandoned long before we ever arrived. Each one was a monument to time's relentless march through this forgotten place. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the car came to a halt. We sat there, the silence pressing in on us. No wind, no noise, just the hum of our own anxious breathing. "It's out of gas," someone said, breaking the silence. I checked the tank. It was completely empty. The moonlight barely cut through the thick fog, casting everything in an eerie, washed-out glow. We stepped out of the car, the ground dry and cracked beneath our feet. The air was thick, almost like it pressed down on my chest. I felt a cold shiver run through me, but none of us spoke of it. We set out on foot, hoping to find some sign of life, some hint of civilization. The fog thickened as we walked, swirling around us, becoming more like a presence than a natural phenomenon. My friends began to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something they didn't want to draw attention to. Hours passed in silence, or so it felt. The land seemed endless. The fog never lifted, and there was no relief from it. Eventually, we came across something that didn't fit. An old wooden structure, half buried by the earth, barely visible beneath the thick fog. We cautiously approached, hoping it might provide some shelter or a clue. As we drew closer, I noticed something else: footprints. They were small, almost childlike, leading away from the building and into the darkness. They didn't seem natural, as though someone had deliberately walked there. Inside the structure, we found what remained of a small forgotten homestead. Rusted tools, cracked furniture, and old, faded photographs of people who were long gone. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the weight of years gone by. That's when we heard the sound, the faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized my friends had stopped moving, frozen, their eyes wide with fear. It came again, more distinct this time. A voice, barely audible, calling from outside. But it wasn't like any voice I had ever heard. It was not human. It was hollow, distant, as though it came from some place beyond this world. Follow. The voice seemed to echo, twisting through the fog. My friends were visibly shaken. We had to get out of there. We had to run. But the fog was thick, blinding us to our surroundings, and the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. We stumbled back toward the car, but it felt like we were moving in circles. The structure faded behind us, lost in the swirling mists. The voice followed us, always just beyond reach. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the car, and something inside told me we shouldn't get in. But we did. As soon as the doors shut, the fog receded slightly. We could see the road again, though it stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. The drive was long, and the silence oppressive. We didn't speak much. None of us could shake the feeling of being watched, as if the fog had followed us, waiting just out of sight. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. All I know is that something wasn't right, and I pray we never cross paths with whatever it was again. I don't remember how I ended up on the hiking trail that day. I'd never been much of an outdoors person, but something about the open air and quiet drew me there. My plan had been simple: spend the afternoon walking along a familiar trail, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. It wasn't a popular trail, tucked deep into the mountains where few people dared to venture. I'd come across it a few times before, but never explored it fully. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The air was crisp, the kind of silence that wraps around you and feels endless. I walked for hours, following the winding trail deeper into the woods, never thinking twice about turning back. It felt peaceful. Too peaceful. The absence of birds, the quiet rustling of leaves. The trail was so isolated I almost expected to hear nothing at all. But still, something nagged at the back of my mind. It was as if the woods themselves were watching. Eventually, I found myself standing at a fork in the path. One side led to a steep incline, the other seemed to stretch on toward the valley below. Without hesitation, I chose the incline, curious about where it might lead. It wasn't until I'd climbed what felt like hours that I realized I was well beyond any familiar landmarks. I told myself to turn back, but something kept me going. The air became colder as I ascended, the trees growing denser. The trail became narrower, and I started to notice strange markings on the bark of the trees. Scratches, like someone had carved symbols into the wood. I brushed them off as some random hiker's curiosity, but there was a pattern, one I couldn't quite place. The farther I went, the quieter it became, until even my own footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A faint, hollow whisper, like the wind carrying someone else's voice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no wind, no breeze. The air was still. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. It was distant, but clear. I stood there, my skin crawling as I listened. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It was all around me. Panic surged through my chest and I turned to run, only to trip over something in the undergrowth. My flashlight bounced away, leaving me in darkness. The woods felt alive, shifting around me as though they were watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, only to find there was no signal. The darkness felt heavier now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to steady myself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just silence, except for that whisper growing closer now, louder, echoing in my ears. "Help me." I turned, panic turning my vision blurry as I saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and pale, standing at the edge of the trail. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its hollow gaze fixated on me. I backed away, my hands shaking, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run before, dodging branches and tripping over rocks. The whisper followed me, always just a step behind. The path seemed endless, the trees shifting and bending as if to block my way. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into an open clearing. The sky above me was dark, stars faintly visible through a break in the trees. My chest heaved as I collapsed to the ground, trembling. The whisper had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The woods were still, too still. I wanted to stay there, but I couldn't. I forced myself to my feet and followed the path I had come from. I kept walking until I saw the faint outline of the trailhead. As I stepped out into the open, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. I could still feel it, though. The heavy weight of the woods, like something was watching, waiting, still following me. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. It was the middle of summer when a group of friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a nearby lake. None of us had ever been there before, but the promise of clear waters and warm sun was too tempting to pass up. The drive wasn't long, just far enough to feel like we were escaping the noise of the city, but not so far that we'd lose cell service. The day started perfectly. We arrived early, claiming a spot near the shore, and spent the afternoon swimming, laughing, and basking in the sunlight. The lake was calm, almost unnaturally so. The water was glassy and there wasn't a single ripple. It was eerie in its stillness, but we were too preoccupied with the warmth and the relaxation to give it much thought. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the water, we decided to go for one last swim before the evening cooled. The water was still as we dove in, and it felt refreshing. The perfect end to a perfect day. But as I swam further out, the light from the setting sun began to fade, and the water became darker. That's when I noticed something strange beneath me. It wasn't an object or a shadow. It was a presence. Something shifted below the surface, too far down for me to make out. My stomach twisted and I stopped swimming, treading water as my eyes strained into the depths. There was nothing visibly there, but I could feel it. A sensation like being watched, like something was studying me from beneath. "Hey," I called out to my friends, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Can you guys feel that? Like something's down there?" They splashed and joked, completely unaware. I didn't tell them how much I wanted to get out of the water. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if the lake itself had become a living, breathing entity, waiting. I swam back to shore, hurried and shaking off the cold, unsure if what I had felt was real. The others were still laughing, throwing a frisbee, soaking up the last of the day's warmth. I tried to forget about the sensation and told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. As we started packing up to leave, I noticed something odd in the sand near our stuff. Tracks. Not footprints, though. Drag marks, deep and deliberate, leading from the water toward the woods. My heart stopped as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the trees, where there was nothing but silence. I didn't say anything to my friends. I couldn't bring myself to. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the lake, the sun now fully set, casting a dark, brooding reflection. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept wondering, what was in that water? And whatever it was it still down there, waiting for us to return? It was a bright, crisp autumn day when I decided to take a long drive out to the old orchard. My family had owned the farm for generations, and though most of the land had been sold off years ago, a small section of the orchard still remained untouched. I figured it would be a nice escape, a chance to walk among the ancient trees and clear my head. The old farmhouse stood at the edge of the orchard, weathered and forgotten. It wasn't much more than a shell these days, just some broken windows, faded paint, and a few scattered remnants of what had once been a thriving farm. I parked my car near the gravel road and made my way down the overgrown path toward the trees. The air was crisp and sharp, the smell of fallen leaves filling my nose. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers toward the sky. They had been planted long before I was born, and now they stood as silent witnesses to the passing of time. I wandered deeper into the orchard, my footsteps crunching over the leaves that blanketed the ground. The silence here was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of branches or the distant call of a crow. I didn't feel afraid, just disconnected, like I was stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. After a while, I sat down under one of the trees, leaning back against the rough bark. The sun was beginning to dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of trees. I closed my eyes for a moment, soaking in the stillness. That's when I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. My eyes snapped open and I strained to listen. The orchard was vast and empty, but the sound was there, just beyond the reach of my sight. It wasn't the wind or some natural noise. It was someone walking through the trees, slow and measured. I stood up, my stomach tightening, and began to walk toward the sound. The footsteps didn't stop, but they never seemed to get any closer either. I kept walking, trying to pinpoint their origin, but the trees twisted and stretched, concealing any clear view. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. A shape, tall and thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, heart racing, and the figure seemed to pause as well. It tilted its head in my direction, and I could see its outline against the fading light. But there was something off about it, a sense of wrongness. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I could feel my breath quickening. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its features were too blurred, too indistinct, as though it were more shadow than flesh. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The figure seemed to drift closer, becoming more solid with each step, yet still somehow not quite there. A chill ran down my spine and I turned to run. My feet pounded against the ground as I pushed through the undergrowth, the sound of the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. I could feel its presence gaining on me, breathing down my neck. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the orchard where my car was parked. I fumbled for my keys, heart pounding as I threw the door open and climbed inside. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. As I drove away from the old orchard, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, shadowy figure following me. It never appeared, but the feeling of being watched never left. To this day, I can't shake the sense that something still lingers there, among those twisted trees, something waiting for me to return. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. I used to visit my grandfather's house every summer when I was a kid. It was an old farmhouse, isolated, sitting at the edge of a quiet valley. My parents used to leave me there for weeks while they traveled, and I never minded. Grandpa was old and grumpy, but he told the best stories about the woods that surrounded us. The house itself wasn't much, a weathered wooden structure with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Outside, there were fields of tall grass stretching endlessly, and beyond that, the forest. One evening, as I explored the woods near his house, I noticed something strange. There was an old, abandoned barn deeper into the trees, one I had never seen before. It stood isolated from the rest of the woods, its roof sagging and walls covered in ivy. It was out of place, and curiosity got the better of me. I approached the barn, my steps quiet on the grass. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, like whispers carried by the wind. I stopped, listening. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside the barn, but there was no sign of life around it. I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the barn was dark, except for slivers of light filtering through the broken roof. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy. It smelled of decay, wood, rot, and something else I couldn't place. I could barely see, but I moved cautiously, my heartbeat quickening. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. A tall, slender shadow that didn't quite belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown louder, almost like they were surrounding me now. I strained to see more, but the figure remained in the shadows. Then, slowly, it moved. Not like a human, though. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if whatever this thing was didn't know how to walk properly. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its hollow eyes. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, the barn now filled with that oppressive silence, only broken by those relentless whispers. And then, from the shadows, I heard a voice. "Help me." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human either, low and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in centuries. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. The whispers became screams, but they were inside my head. I could feel them, clawing at my mind. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bent awkwardly as if they didn't belong to a living thing, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I collapsed to the floor, unable to move or think. My heart thundered in my chest, and the barn was silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, unsure if the fear or the silence was worse. When I finally managed to stand, I left the barn and didn't look back. The rest of the summer passed without further incident. My grandfather never mentioned the barn, and I never brought it up. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be there. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yard standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was a calm evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the beach. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sand as we arrived. We parked near the shore, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. There were only a few scattered families and a couple of couples enjoying the evening, but the vast beach felt almost empty. The horizon stretched endlessly, the ocean in front of us glowing with the fading light of the day. We set up a small bonfire, sitting on the warm sand, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows. The sound of the waves was soothing, and the cool breeze carried the smell of the sea. For a while, everything felt perfect. It was one of those simple moments you cherish. Good company, good weather, and nothing but the vast ocean around you. As the night deepened, we got lost in conversation, laughing and sharing stories. Time slipped away. At some point, I noticed the others had fallen into a comfortable silence, gazing out at the water. I turned to look at them, but something felt off. The ocean was unusually quiet. There was no typical hum of waves crashing against the shore, no seagulls squawking. It felt still, as though the entire beach had been frozen in time. I got up and walked to the edge of the water, the sand cooling beneath my feet. The horizon stretched endlessly, the darkening sky blending with the sea. But that silence, it gnawed at me, crawling under my skin. A faint glow emerged from the water, far out beyond the waves. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the moon, but the light wasn't reflecting off the surface. It was coming from beneath it. A pulse, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat. I called out to my friends, but no sound came from my mouth. I turned around to them, but they weren't there anymore. I was alone. Panic set in as I turned back to the ocean. The glow was closer now, stretching closer to the surface. I could see it more clearly, an unnatural, eerie light that seemed to come from something below. A figure emerged from the water, pale and translucent. Its face was obscured, its body skeletal, almost ghost-like. It didn't move like a living thing. It glided toward me with a slow, unsettling grace, the light from beneath its form illuminating the dark waters. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to look away. The creature came closer, and I could feel its presence invading my mind, as if it had seen straight through me. The air was thick, and the sound of the waves had vanished entirely. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The figure stopped, its shadow stretching toward me. But it didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel the weight of its gaze, its intent, silent and suffocating. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the water, vanishing without a trace. The ocean returned to its restless state, waves crashing against the shore once more. The sound returned, but it no longer felt familiar. The beach was empty again, and my friends had never been there. I stood there, heart racing, staring at the vast, dark ocean. Alone. Whatever had come from the water was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. It had taken something with it, something I couldn't explain, and I was left wondering if it would ever come back. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed. A break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold. A trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp, toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail. the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, no memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows. I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low, as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. Come. Closer. The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The park had been closed for decades, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by everyone. The faded, crumbling entrance sign seemed to scream out to us, promising something eerie and unknown. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. We wandered down the cracked paths, past the rusting remnants of broken rides. The Ferris wheel stood towering, skeletal and empty. Everything felt frozen in time, silent, lifeless, and oddly oppressive. No laughter or music from forgotten years echoed through the park, only the distant creak of old metal and the occasional rustling of leaves. We kept moving deeper into the park, unsure of what we were hoping to find. It wasn't the typical thrill of the unknown. It felt darker. As we approached the old carousel, I noticed something odd. The wooden horses weren't just decaying. They seemed to have faces carved into them, hollow eyes, twisted grins. I instinctively stepped back, my pulse quickening. "What the hell is this?" someone whispered. We tried to laugh it off, but the unease was settling in too deeply. There were too many strange details, small things we couldn't ignore. The once bright colors of the rides had faded into drab, muted hues, and the air felt dense, as though it was pressing in on us. At one point, we came across an old photo booth. It was the only thing still relatively intact. The curtain was tattered, flapping in the wind, and the once vivid pictures printed from the machine were scattered across the floor. I bent down to pick one up, an image of a family smiling, frozen in time. But something wasn't right. The smiles were crooked, their eyes staring past the camera as if they were looking at something we couldn't see. Something about that photo sent a chill down my spine. I looked up, expecting to see my friends, but they had wandered off, further into the park. I hesitated for a moment before following them, clutching the photograph tightly. The deeper we went, the more things began to feel off. The sounds we had heard earlier, the creaking, the wind, began to shift into something unnatural. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves anymore, it was the faint, distant sound of laughter, but it wasn't coming from us. The laughter seemed to come from the depths of the park, distorted and hollow, echoing in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It felt like it was all around us, but we couldn't see a source. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us dared to speak. We eventually found ourselves near the old roller coaster, once grand, now rotted and skeletal. The metal rails were twisted, dangling in midair like broken teeth. Below it, there was an old wooden bench covered in mold. A single flicker of something caught my eye, a small faded envelope resting on the bench. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and picked it up. It was sealed shut, but the paper was worn and fragile. I opened it carefully, revealing a single faded photograph inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same photo booth picture I had found earlier, a family frozen in time, but this one was different. The figures were closer, and their eyes weren't lifeless anymore. They were watching me, staring directly at me. Through the picture, as if they knew I had it, I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I glanced up, heart racing, and realized the laughter had stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Suddenly, my friends were screaming from deeper within the park. "Run!" someone shouted. "Get out of here!" I didn't think twice. I shoved the photo back into the envelope and bolted, my legs pumping as the distant cries of my friends echoed in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance of the park. The moment I stepped onto the pavement, the air seemed lighter, but my heart was still pounding. I didn't dare look back. That night, back home, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The photo was still clutched tightly in my hand, the faces of the family still watching. I haven't been able to bring myself to throw it away. Whatever was out there in that park, whatever was left behind, it's still following me. I can feel it. And every night, I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with a grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter, leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet. and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above. The creaking of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. The quiet solitude of nature was something I craved, especially after long, stressful weeks. One summer afternoon, I decided to head to a remote trail I'd been eyeing for months. It wasn't marked on most maps, secluded deep in the forest. The trailhead was a dirt path hidden off a narrow road, barely visible to anyone passing by. The hike started as usual. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I reveled in the stillness, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of birds overhead. For hours, I trekked through the dense woods, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. The trail eventually began to narrow, the trees pressing in around me. It wasn't long before I realized I'd lost my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but neither gave me any clue as to which direction I should go. I sat down on a large rock, trying to collect my thoughts, but the sense of isolation began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I wasn't truly lost, just turned around. But as the hours passed and the sunlight dimmed, I started feeling something was wrong. The forest felt heavier. The usual sounds of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as though the woods themselves had become aware of my presence. I pressed on, my pace quickening, though fear began to seep into my bones. I needed to get out of there. The trail eventually split into two. I didn't know which way to go, so I flipped a coin. Heads. I took the right path. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to loom, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The sun had set, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Shadows danced in the light, appearing as figures just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of my own boots against the ground, but something lighter, quicker. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, approaching rapidly, echoing unnaturally close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response, just the sound of rustling leaves. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, shining it in every direction. The forest felt alive now, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took off running, but the footsteps followed, always just behind me. I could hear them breathing, ragged and shallow, as though the thing was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees bending and creaking with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Exhausted, I collapsed against a tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly quiet again. I could feel something watching me, something I couldn't see, yet I knew it was there, standing just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees. The world around me seemed to blur, and then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it wasn't human. Its presence radiated something cold, something inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran. The woods stretched endlessly, the path disappearing beneath my feet. I could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, lighter now but unmistakably close. And then, through the haze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, I glimpsed something hanging from a tree, faint and twisted in the darkness. A figure, a face. It wasn't human, not anymore, just a hollow, warped shape that hung from the tree, swaying gently in the wind. I screamed and ran faster, but I knew it was always right behind me. I didn't stop, couldn't stop, until I burst out of the forest and stumbled into the light of day, gasping for air. I made it out, but even now, I can still feel it, watching, waiting, in the dark, just beyond the edge of sight. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip, it was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face, only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. It was a quiet night when I found myself wandering through the dimly lit corridors of an old museum. The place had been closed to the public for months, but someone, somehow, had managed to gain access. I wasn't supposed to be there, but curiosity got the better of me. I'd always loved the idea of exploring abandoned places, especially ones as mysterious and ancient as this museum. The building itself was massive, filled with towering exhibits of relics from long-lost civilizations. The flickering overhead lights cast eerie shadows that stretched along the cracked marble floors, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The air smelled of dust and age, like the very walls were holding on to secrets they didn't want to let go of. As I walked deeper into the museum, my footsteps echoed louder than I'd expected. It was too quiet, almost as if the place had swallowed any sound that dared to linger. I wandered aimlessly, passing through rooms filled with ancient artifacts that seemed to whisper of forgotten lives. The silence was deafening, and every corner I turned felt more oppressive. In one of the exhibit halls, I came across an old display case holding what looked like a cracked, worn statue. It was humanoid, but twisted, with hollow eyes and a carved expression that seemed to leer. I stood there, transfixed by its unsettling presence, until a sudden creak behind me jolted me from my thoughts. I spun around, heart racing. Nothing. Still, the sound felt far too real, far too close. I decided it was time to leave, but as I made my way back toward the entrance, something caught my eye. A faint light, distant but unmistakable, flickering at the end of the hall. My first thought was someone had followed me inside, but the museum was supposed to be locked up tight. There was no way anyone could have gotten in unnoticed. My gut twisted, but I couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. I moved closer, the silence now deafening, every footstep echoing in the vast emptiness. The closer I got to the flickering light, the more I realized it wasn't from a torch or flashlight. It came from something much older, something ancient. It wasn't warm like a fire. It was cold and spectral, flickering like a dying ember. As I neared the source, the light revealed a figure standing there, motionless and still. I froze. The figure wasn't human, or at least not entirely. Its form was hollow, distorted, long, bony limbs, skin stretched taut over bone. Its face was a hollow void, empty sockets where eyes should have been. The figure remained still, its posture rigid, yet something about it felt alive, as if it were waiting for me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. The flickering light cast distorted shadows across the creature's gaunt, emaciated form. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced. Was this some kind of display? A prop? But the figure felt far too real. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice was barely audible. The creature didn't move. It simply stood there, unmoving. The light flickered again, and in that brief moment of brightness, I saw something. A glimpse of its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile, the kind of smile that didn't belong to any living thing. I knew then that whatever this thing was, it wasn't from this world. Panic took hold, and I spun around to run, my breath hitching as I sprinted through the darkened halls, the flickering light fading behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the exit, pushing open the heavy door and stepping out into the cool night air. The museum was silent again, but I could still feel the weight of whatever I had seen. I don't know if it was a spirit, a lost soul, or something far worse. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever that thing was, it was still there, waiting in the shadows. I never thought a simple evening trip to the beach could turn into something so terrifying. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quick getaway with a few friends. Just a drive down to the coast, a few hours of quiet by the water, and the calm of the waves lapping against the shore. We arrived around sunset, the sky a canvas of deep oranges and purples. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few other couples and a group of friends setting up a fire further down. The air was crisp but not cold, the sound of the waves a soothing backdrop. My friends and I found a spot near the water, spread out our blanket, and cracked open a few beers. It was perfect, peaceful, relaxing. We talked about nothing important, watching the horizon as the sun dipped lower into the sea. It was when the sky went dark that things started to feel off. The first clue came when I noticed the distant glow of a single flashlight, bobbing up and down as if someone were walking toward us along the shore. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe someone out for a late-night stroll. But then I noticed the way the light kept moving erratically, as if they couldn't decide where they were going. "Hey, does anyone else see that?" I asked, pointing toward the light. My friends followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just someone lost," one of them shrugged, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The closer the light got, the more it seemed to flicker, as though whoever was carrying it couldn't see what they were doing. It bobbed and darted erratically, weaving along the water's edge like something lost at sea. Then, suddenly, the light disappeared. I was about to dismiss it when a low, guttural moan carried over the sound of the waves. My friends froze, glancing around. "What was that?" someone whispered. We all strained our ears, searching the darkness. The moan came again, this time louder, more distinct. It didn't sound human, more like a creature, something primal and unsettling. The moans echoed between the cliffs, bouncing across the empty beach. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice trembling. We grabbed our stuff and started walking back toward the car, the unease growing with every step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of black beach stretching before us. It wasn't until we reached the car that the second clue hit me. My phone buzzed. No service. Not a single bar. The town was only about 20 minutes away, and usually we'd have signal. But now, nothing. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances as we climbed into the car. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I drove, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror. The beach was behind us, just darkness now, but I still felt like something was there, something following us. That's when I saw it, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. A figure, tall, thin, and hunched over, walking in the opposite direction from us, toward the shore. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who the hell is that?" one of my friends whispered, staring in shock at the figure. I couldn't answer. The figure didn't look human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying us from afar. And that flashlight, it wasn't being held properly. It bobbed erratically as if whoever was holding it couldn't see straight. The figure moved closer to the water's edge, fading in and out of the darkness, then stopped. It stood there, motionless, staring in our direction. My friends and I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hit the gas, tires squealing as we raced back toward town. The whole way, I kept glancing back, expecting to see the figure chasing us. But it was gone. When we got to the edge of town, I pulled over, gasping for air. The tension was still there, but nothing followed us. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us, waited, and we had been too blind to notice. We've never spoken of that night again,